like to welcome everybody today to our discussion about depression and anxiety. I'm Joe Newman with Life Launch Centers. I'm the Director of Business Development. And today with me, I've got Ben Harris, also with Life Launch Centers. And Ben, why don't you take a little bit and introduce yourself?
Like you said, my name's Ben Harris. I'm a counselor, been in this business for over 30 years.
30 years.
Almost 33 years.
Seen a lot of those years.
And been around. I have my own family and have raised kids. I now have grandkids. And I'm excited about what we're going to talk about here today because I think it's more relevant than it's ever been and more relevant than a lot of things we're concerned about today. Is really looking at anxiety, depression, looking at resilience, looking at, the ability that particularly our kids coming up and growing up have to get up out of the dirt and brush themselves off and keep moving forward. More and more and more, we're seeing the tendency to just sit.
To give up.
Yeah.
Yeah, as a parent, we've had 7 kids and, that's on top priority in my mind is how do I raise my kids in such a way that they're going to be successful and have the emotional tools they need to be able to get past these difficult things that inevitably come to everybody's life. So it's great opportunity to be involved in this work. And I really, really enjoy the principles, the curriculum that we teach, the resilience model that we're going to go through today, and how that really does give those tools to our youth that they're looking for and to the family. It's not just a kid thing, right?
Right. Well, and I think that's important. This is about tools.
Yeah.
This is about giving them something that they can actually use. And, there's a place for therapy. And, again, I've been a part of this therapy business for 33 years. But there's a need for tools. There's a need for a practical application of things that are actually going to help deal with some of these things. They don't have to be. They don't have to have the negative impact they're having right now. They don't have to.
So let's talk a little bit about those tools and maybe a little bit of like the need. I don't know that everybody knows about how prolific anxiety and depression really are, but there's some pretty staggering numbers, and you got some interesting statistics you came prepared with.
Yeah, and I thought about this, and a lot of reason thinking about a good friend of ours that we had opportunities to work with and talk to after president, and that's Colin Karchner.
Great guy, amazing work that he was doing to try to help increase awareness for families about the dangers of social media and how, as he interacted with so many youth in school setting, he would come and do assemblies. How they found out how much damage social media was doing and how much anxiety and depression the kids were experiencing because of the pressures of technology on today.
Yeah, unfortunately, we lost him unexpectedly and suddenly this year, and our thoughts and hearts go out to his family. But
absolutely,
we had an opportunity, you and I, actually standing there talking with him after one of his presentations, and he said, guys, I'm a great fire alarm. I'm really good at getting out there and
raising awareness.
Yeah, telling everybody there's a problem. And he says, but we need more fire extinguishers.
Yeah, he turned to us and he said, I just told everybody about the problem and I'm on my way out the door. And I know it's up to you guys to actually come in with the extinguisher and help put out the problem, actually do the work. Right. And that's what we really want to present today, to help give you some of those tools that you can extinguish some of the effects of anxiety and depression.
But in his honor, I wanted to start by setting kind of a context for why this is important that we're talking about this today. At 32%, 1 in 3 adolescents, by the time they turn 18, will meet all the criteria for anxiety disorder. 1 in 3.
So I have 7 kids. That means at least 2 of them.
At least. Yeah, at least 2 of your kids.
Yeah.
Adults are around 19%, but 32% for adolescents. And they did a little survey with some college freshmen, and they just asked them the question about coming into college and with, testing and performance expectations and moving away from home and all of those things that happen with, leaving home and going off to college. they asked them the question, are you overwhelmed to the point of wanting to get out, wanting to quit, wanting to give up?
Yeah.
And they ran this survey in 1985. And in 1985, 18% of the freshmen said, yes, I feel that kind of stress. They ran it 15 years later in 2000, and it jumped 10% to 28% in those 15 years. Now, here's what gets really scary, is that from 2000 to 2016, it's jumped to 41%.
41%.
Almost half of the freshmen going off to college are reporting that they feel so overwhelmed that they would rather
just give up.
Back up, back out, go back
Quit.
into their basement, their room, put a video game back on the TV or computer, and kind of disappear because it's too overwhelming, it's too stressful.
I've seen that with many of my friends and family, and it is very distressing for parents.
It is. Well, and what gets really scary about this is that only 80% of those people that meet the criteria for anxiety disorder, so we're talking about significant impairment in their life. We're talking about they are negatively impacted by the anxiety that they experience. 80% of those people aren't getting any help at all.
Yeah.
There's nothing happening for them. And if left unchecked, anxiety results in depression at all different levels. It can result in substance use and other escapist kind of behaviors, other addictive kind of things, and then ultimately and unfortunately can result in suicide.
Yeah. Which we're seeing way too much of that. And I think that's in the back of every parent's mind. Like, we know that that's a growing problem, and it's a big fear that we would ever have a family member get to that point, or maybe ourselves even get to that point.
Yeah.
But it is absolutely real. Something we got to pay attention to.
Well, we know that depression is one of the leading causes of illness and disability in adolescents. We also know that suicide is the number 3 leading cause of death among adolescents ages 15 to 19. So we have to take it seriously. It's not just a phase. It's not something that we,
take lightly.
Well, and just sit back and hope it goes away.
Yeah.
We've got to address it. And really what we're going to talk about today isn't just for somebody experiencing, high levels of anxiety. It's not just for somebody who's depressed. It's not just for these skills that we're talking about. This knowledge that we're going to share today is for everybody.
Yeah, and it's brain-based research. So it's not just something we came up with. It's kind of a conglomerate of dialectical behavior therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, a lot of the resilience research done by Brene Brown, some of the most cutting edge and leading research. So that's what I love about it. It's not just talk, it's tools.
Right. So here we go.
Let's do it.
I think as we want to understand this, we're going to start with the brain, which is where all of these things start. But to understand why the brain reacts the way it does, we lay out a foundation of understanding how important and how fundamentally key, the idea of values and goals are.
Yeah.
So we've got to have a direction. If we don't pick a direction will be picked for us.
Well, and that's kind of that's very common, where, especially among youth and young adults, they have tried to align their values and goals with their parents or with society, or somebody else has tried to give them their values. And at some point they have to establish what their values are intrinsically, like what they really value. Because once they start to do that, then they are motivated to move towards what they want, not what somebody else is telling them what they should want. Is that kind of the idea behind the values?
Well, I also think, even like for me, my values are different today than they were 10 years ago. So I need to stay, current. I need to take time and have the presence of mind to stop and say, okay, what are my values today?
Yeah.
Because when our behavior gets out of alignment with our values, we have trouble.
Yeah.
That's where depression and anxiety, and that's where, the troubles in our relationships start to really step in and have an impact, negative impact on our life, is when our behavior isn't in line with our values. And so hard to be in line with your values if you don't know what they are.
Or even what values are.
Right.
We have to talk to people about values are not like physical objects. Some people say, well, I value my car, or I value my boat or whatever. But we're talking about non-things, things like trust, like honesty, like adventure or friendship. And it can be kind of difficult for people to come upon those ideas. And we kind of go through a process to help narrow down from a large list in such a way that they're able to really focus in on what are those two key values in their life.
Exactly. And so as we get clear about what our values are, it allows us to then lay out a plan, or, a map, if you will. And those are goals. We start to, attach very specific behaviors and specific tasks and time frames and measuring ability to this map and this direction that we're now going. And by doing that, we have some control in our life, which is a big one for us human beings.
We want control.
We want control, and if we're honest with ourselves, there's very little we actually have any control over. And so, anytime we can grab something like this and feel like we have a little control, it's
motivating.
It's definitely a good thing. So, as we establish those goals and values, it gives us a purpose for understanding what we're going to talk about. That this is the context. This is the reason why this is important and why I should take any time to listen to this presentation or pay attention to what we're talking about here.
We'll put this up on screen so you can see here too. But right after values and goals, we're going to go into brain development.
Yeah, we're going to talk about how that works and why that's important to understand. So as we talk about that, let's talk about the very first part of the brain that's developed in the womb as we as human beings begin to develop, and that is the hindbrain. It's right at the base of the brain, right at the top of the spinal column, and it's responsible for survival. Period.
The automatic life support function.
Yeah, it makes our heart beat and our lungs work and those kinds of things, but it also is concerned with preserving those things as well from, dealing with external things. And so its really purpose, its sole purpose is survival.
And it mostly functions without thinking about it until some of those functions are endangered, like breathing or like hunger, right? Thirst, those things, once it realizes, whoa, I'm in big danger if I don't have air.
Well, and again, we're not conscious of that.
Yeah.
That part of our brain just automatically kicks in.
Yeah.
And here's why. Because the next part of the brain to develop is the midbrain.
Right.
And here's a part of the brain we haven't known a lot about until the last 10 or 15 years. And part of the reason is because in the last 10 or 15 years, we have the ability to take pictures of this part of our brain.
Yeah,
we can see this stuff, and we see what's going on, and we see it's firing, and when it fires, and how much it fires. All of these things. We're beginning to understand the neurochemicals that are involved.
You can measure those chemicals and the amounts.
It's amazing what that does. And so what we found, though, is that midbrain has more to do with all parts of our life than we ever knew.
Yeah.
For example, that part of our brain is really responsible for our emotions. That's the emotional center of our existence. Is right there in the midbrain, and it'll coordinate information. It brings in information and then sends messages out to different parts of the brain based on the needs that we have after it receives that information. It also stores emotional memory.
Yeah.
And that's a part of how it makes those decisions, where to send, those signals to the other parts of the brain, is based on experience, based on where we've had some experiences before. And then I'm going to come back to the midbrain here in a second. But the next part of our brain to develop is the forebrain. Now, the forebrain doesn't start to develop until much later, actually, really when we're out of the womb, and doesn't become effective or really usable in our life until we're, 8, 9, 10, 11 years old. which is very interesting.
Yeah. Explain a lot about my little kids, honestly.
Well, and about me sometimes. Here's why. The forebrain is responsible for logical thought.
Yeah.
It's responsible for problem solving. It's responsible for the executive function in my life. That's the operation of the business of my life.
Yeah.
And so it's a very logical, rational experience. Well, here's where it gets really important to understand why that midbrain is key, is because in the midbrain, we have this little piece called an amygdala. There's actually two of them, amygdalae, if you want to use the plural, right, one on each side. But the amygdala is responsible for watching out for threats. So it's kind of sonar, and a smoke alarm.
So it's what fires the alarm of, hey, there's a threat.
Yes, exactly. Now, the amygdala doesn't discriminate between threats. It doesn't discriminate between big threat and little threat. It doesn't discriminate between an internal threat, that I bring upon myself, or one that's coming, externally at me.
Or even a perceived threat versus a real.
Right. And to that point, for example, I'm walking down a path in the woods and I come across a bear.
Yeah.
Well, my amygdala is going to immediately recognize the threat, and it's going to send a message, and anytime it perceives a threat, the first message goes to the hindbrain. It goes to the part of our brain that's responsible for survival.
Yeah.
Which makes sense.
Absolutely. You got to make sure you're going to be alive.
Right. If I'm going to stand there and look at this bear and have to go through a logical, rational thought process to decide what I'm going to do with this bear in front of me.
Is that a Kodiak bear or is that a grizzly?
Exactly.
You're not going to think about it. You just
no. So that survival part of our brain kicks in immediately. Yeah. Well, what we've learned is that when it does, as soon as that hindbrain kicks in and goes into survival mode, that's where we get that fight, flight, or freeze response.
Right. And you don't even really get to choose which of those three.
No,
it's almost pre-programmed.
Well, because we're not using our forebrain. And there's a reason why. And that's because the forebrain has gone offline.
Yeah.
It's completely shut down.
Literally, through the brain scan, you can see the electrical synapse shut off.
Yep.
Go dark.
Yeah.
And all of the electrical synapse in the brain focuses around the midbrain and hindbrain.
Yeah. Because we have to live.
Yeah.
That's the only concern right now is living. But if you think about that, though, in now this context, and when we go back to talking about it doesn't discriminate, when a teenager posts a photo on Instagram and doesn't get any likes,
no comments,
the amygdala recognizes that as a threat and treats it exactly the same way as it treats the bear on the path.
Well, going back to your primitive statement about the amygdala, it's because when you think about it, if, in caveman times or whatever, primitive time, if you weren't accepted in your clan, in your social circle, what did that say about your survival ability?
Right.
You would be ostracized and your survival was in question.
Right.
And so that's what is happening today with Instagram and some of these reinforcers of, social acceptance. And when they're not seeing that, then that's why they become so emotionally
right. When the amygdala senses that threat that we may no longer be a part of the tribe, it treats it again like we're standing in front of a bear on a path in the woods.
Yeah.
And our hindbrain kicks in. We go into fight, flight, or freeze, just like we would with the bear. And unfortunately, that shuts off the logical, rational part of our brain. And so we're not thinking through this at this moment. We are reacting, and we're going to do whatever we need to do to survive at that point. And unfortunately, that often means there's a lot of cleanup later.
Yeah.
We say things we didn't mean. We
break things.
Yeah, we break things. We hurt relationships.
Yeah.
There's some consequences to that happening. But I think what's really key about us being able to talk about this and understand that that's what's going on is a couple of things. One is that this is normal.
And it happens to everybody
We all do this.
almost every day.
Right. And so, if I'm experiencing this, I don't have to worry if I'm broken. I don't have to worry if I'm, unique and need to, disengage and isolate myself because I'm broken.
Right.
No, this is normal and this is what we all do. But number two, and I think this is really important, and this has had an impact on my marriage. This has had an impact on a lot of relationships in my life, and that is that because I understand this about myself, and I know that this is normal for everyone, I now understand this about you.
Yeah. So it's like it gives you a lot more ability to cut people slack.
Exactly. I know that there are times when I should not have a conversation with my wife.
Yeah. Instead of, no, we're going to fix this now.
Right.
That's my, where I go often, and it's not helpful.
Right, exactly. And so for us to think that we're going to, solve a problem with somebody who isn't in the logical problem-solving part of their brain is going to be very disappointing.
Yeah.
And often results in then me being frustrated to the point where I end up in the survival part of my brain and not in the rational problem-solving part of my brain.
Yeah. So it's fight and fight, or fight and freeze, or fight and flight, or there's all. Exactly. Those don't usually go together very well.
Exactly. And so when we start to think through life, we can find a lot of places where this threat can show up. Walking into a testing room at college, or even in high school to do your ACT or SATs. There's so much riding on these scores, and a
lot of pressure.
And that's where you freeze. All of a sudden, all this information I know I have, I can't retrieve. It's gone. It's
inhibits your ability to use your forebrain to get that information that's stored in there.
And as this gets worse, if left unchecked and we don't address this and we don't use some practical skills to deal with it, then I stop going to school.
Right.
I stop socializing.
You don't have a desire to get a degree from a college and progress, like some of the goals you may have earlier.
I may even withdraw from my family.
Yeah.
And disappear into the basement and.
Because it's hard, and we choose not to engage in hard.
Exactly. So as we're talking about, and now we're just going to move into the next part of this model, as we now understand this is how the brain works. Well, the next part of the model is we've been talking about triggering events. So that bear in the path, that's a triggering event.
Or the Instagram post.
Yeah, the Instagram post with no likes. Or, it may be I walk into, a business meeting and I've got a great idea and I'm going to propose this great idea. Mm-hmm. And I throw it out there and nobody says anything. I hear crickets.
Yeah.
For me, that's going to be a triggering event.
Yeah.
And
my wife let me know when I come home, if I don't say hello to her, then she expects that there's something wrong, and that could be a triggering event. So triggering event is just simply what alerts that amygdala that there's a potential threat. And the amygdala immediately goes into action, starts sending some messages to that survival part of the brain. And again, that's really important to understand, but it's also important to understand that we have to be aware that that's what's happening. Yeah.
That's probably the biggest problem for all of us, is that we're often unaware of what's really going on.
And it's that awareness that really gives us a choice.
Yes.
It's kind of that, like you often say, a miracle moment where you're like, oh, now I see what we've been talking about earlier. What am I going to do now?
Right.
How am I going to choose?
It gives us the ability to make a choice, like you said. That's that beautiful moment. And by practicing mindfulness, and we really encourage this with everyone we work with, by practicing mindfulness, we can improve our ability to see those things at much earlier stages, at stages when we can use a few skills and make a big difference, as opposed to, when it gets further down the road, when we're, in severe emotional distress. It's going to take a lot of work to get back out of that.
And there's some specific methods for mindfulness, but I think before I started working in this industry, it was like kind of ambiguous about what mindfulness meant. But ultimately, what it is just stepping back and taking a third-party objective view of the situation and being able to make a choice, rather than feeling like you're in the moment and you have to react. It's kind of a non-judgmental perspective of the situation. And that's more or less like what I think we were talking about in the early stages, but there's also mindfulness practices that can help you dial in with your senses and your environment.
Well, and mindfulness is really literally the practice of exercising your brain, just like you would, muscles going to the
Doing
gym.
sit-ups or curls or
literally it's exercising your brain, and it's exercising and increasing your capacity to be aware of what's going on in front of you right now.
Yeah.
For example, I love to read. I'm a bit of a slow reader, but I love to read. And I'll read 5 or 6 pages before I realize that I have no idea what I've been reading because my head
Was
has
elsewhere.
gone somewhere else.
Yeah.
And my problem isn't that my head went somewhere else. And I think that's what's important and something that everybody needs to understand. Our mind wanders.
On purpose.
It has to.
Yeah.
That's the amygdala. That's our ability to stay alive and stay safe.
Yeah.
Is our mind is constantly wandering around to things. So that's normal.
Yeah.
What's not normal is to read 5 or 6 pages and not know that my head is somewhere else.
Yeah.
And
It's
so
an untrained brain.
Exactly. And that's all it is, because really getting into mindfulness, a mindfulness practice and exercise has increased my awareness to the point where now I'm a paragraph, maybe 2, while
Awesome.
I'm reading before I realize. And
You've
then,
wandered.
that I've wandered. And there's been a side benefit to that too that I wasn't expecting necessarily. And that is that my wife says to me one day, I just have to say, you're so much more attentive with the kids.
Yeah.
You're so much more attentive with the grandkids. And she says, and you know what, even with me. She says, I noticed that the grandkids don't stand there and have to yell at you, hey, before they finally get your attention.
Right.
Because you're present, you're here. And I really believe that that's a direct result of the mindfulness practices that I've been involved in. And so being aware here is really key, because if we're aware that we've been triggered, if we're aware that our emotional distress levels are increasing, then we can do something about it. In fact, let's just move right along here. When we've been triggered and that hindbrain, that survival part of our brain, takes over to the point where our forebrain shuts off, we call that emotional hijacking.
The midbrain has taken over the rest of the brain function.
Basically
To say,
hijacked.
we have to pay attention to survival right now.
Yep.
So it's almost kind of unhelpful to try to ask somebody to make logical kind of thoughts
Exactly.
when they're in that emotional hijacking, state.
Right. So first thing we've got to do when we're aware that we're hijacked, first thing we have to do is we have to check the intensity of that. Mm-hmm. We have to see how intense is the emotional distress I'm experiencing. On a scale of 0 to 100, I know that when I get to about a 70 or 75, I've lost my ability to make good, rational, logical decisions.
Well, and when you're using numbers, those are all logical thought process. And so as you're like trying to assess and give a number to your emotion or your intensity of your emotions, then you're starting to move a little bit of power back to that forebrain.
Right. In fact, at this point, if I've checked my intensity level and I realize where I'm at on that scale, it helps me decide now what tools do I need to use. Because, some tools are pretty simple. Maybe I just need to do a little breathing because I'm kind of lower on that scale. Right. And if I do just a little bit of breathing, I'm back into that forebrain. It may be that my emotional distress is much more intense than that, though. And so I may need to do some other things. In fact, I may need to count the squares in the room.
Again,
just for a minute.
Process, right.
We're moving kind of from right brain over to left brain, getting into the logical side instead of the emotional side. And that helps to start bringing that distress level down. I may have, a song that I know has an impact on my emotional ability. Very powerful music is.
Now, these are all what we're talking about called distress tolerance tools. Is that right?
Yes. And so these tools then start to become out of our toolbox. These are our weapons. These are our.
This is the actual stuff you do.
Yeah.
To exercise resilience.
This is the most important survival equipment we have.
Yeah.
You know, it's not the running, it's not the fighting, it's not the freezing that's the most important. These are the most important survival tools that we have.
That you use in those moments of being emotionally hijacked.
This is where resilience comes from.
Yeah.
This gives us the ability to bounce back when we've been crushed.
And I love that because there's a few other tools that we're going to talk about, but this is like a toolbox. It's kind of like, you know, I think about a lot of people go to the gym and there's specific exercises, specific muscles they want to focus on, and there's specific exercises they use to develop those muscles.
Right.
And these distress tolerance tools, like you were talking about, are those that develop that muscle of resilience.
Yeah, and they range anywhere from ice diving, which is literally putting your face into a bowl of ice and water, and it triggers the vagal nerve, which slows everything down in your body, or tactical breathing, which, you know, the Navy SEALs use to keep their emotions regulated, and or
practicing mindfulness.
Yeah,
like
practicing mindfulness, or it's there's some physical things. If I put my hand on my chest, I feel better.
Yeah.
You know, there's some connection there. I feel almost like mom's holding me, you know, for a minute. Or
I often talk about the hand on the face thing.
Yeah.
So this is a natural, what they call self-compassionate touch. And I've realized that as I do this, I feel the breath of my mouth against, or my nose against the palm of my hand. And that's kind of like reassuring my body that I'm still breathing. I'm not dead. I'm still warm. Like, we're still here. It's okay. But everybody knows when somebody's doing this, they're dealing with some intense emotion.
Yes, exactly. So, and there are lots and lots and lots of these distress tolerance tools, and they can be found on the internet, really, a lot of different places. And I encourage people, go find those, because if you can increase your capacity to be aware of what's going on with you, that's a good thing. But you're going to find that you recognize maybe more often than you thought that you're distressed. Yeah. And you're going to want these tools
and
when it happens.
You got to try them out because they're kind of individual. You know, each person we work with, they are able to define which tools work best for them. You mentioned how you like that feeling of your hand on your chest. But for me, I was a wrestler in high school. And when there's hands on my undercarriage, I'm in fight mode. Like, I'm ready to brawl. And so that's not one that works for me. Right. You know, I'd much rather do this one, honestly.
Right. Right. And again, there's so many of them. You know, we could take a week to try and talk through all of those. But anyway, so as we start to use these distress tolerance tools, we start to bring that distress level down. When we do, we start to have the ability to do some now additional things. For example, the next part of this process is us identifying the emotion that we're feeling.
And can I say, that is getting increasingly difficult with youth and young adults today.
Not just with youth and young adults. How many adults do you know that you can sit down and have a conversation with them and just ask them, how do you feel? And they're able to tell you. Yeah. Not very many. It's not something we do in our society.
Well, I think, this is just me, this is just personal, I think emojis play into that. Like, you don't type what you feel, you just look at this picture of what a little yellow smiley face feels, and you put that on there, right? Instead of actually having to come up with the word to describe what you're saying, or how you're feeling, excuse me. And I don't know, that's just me. I feel like that's contributing to our lack of being able to identify with our emotions.
Well, and it certainly has, all of these things have an impact, but it's just culturally, it's not something that we spend a lot of time. It's not important enough to us to spend a lot of time practicing.
Or thinking about it.
Yeah, and you know, sitting around the kitchen table while we're having dinner and talking about how we feel. There's a vulnerability in talking about emotions that gets kind of scary.
That's a big one, vulnerability.
Then there comes that amygdala again, you know, saying, "Oh, that's a threat," and then we, you know, start to shift out of that ability to do that.
And hijacked again. Yeah.
This is something we have to practice, and it's something we have to do. And because we're not very good at it, it's important to understand too that emotions are experienced physically.
Yeah.
We feel emotions physically.
There's a chemical release in the brain that causes your body to experience sensations.
And so sometimes I may not be able to give my emotion a feeling, and I'm not exactly sure what I'm feeling, but I know what I'm experiencing physically. There are physical sensations that I'm experiencing when my hands get really cold. It's usually before I have to speak before a great big huge crowd, and it's because I'm nervous. I'm really anxious. And because of that, my hands get really cold. Or sometimes I get a tightness in my chest, or I may have a headache, or depending on if I'm angry or if I'm afraid or if I'm whatever that may be. And again, through practice, I've been able to start to connect these physical sensations with emotions. And it's important because of this. If we can name the emotion, if we can give it a name, we will reduce the distress level of it by up to 70%.
Wow. And that's again because there's logical thought process happening. In order to pull a name out, you've got to sort through all these files inside your brain and say, okay, here's this name of this emotion that describes these sensations I'm having. And that's all, again, just putting power back into that forebrain.
Well, and that's part of it. A big part of it is that it's cathartic. And you've probably heard that word before. It's basically the process of being able to work your way through emotions, but by feeling them, as opposed to numbing them, as opposed to shutting them down. And
allowing them.
Yeah, experiencing them, expressing them, sharing them with others. And there's a real power in that, and it takes power out of the emotion.
Gotcha.
And that emotion that has so much control and so much power over our immediate, situation, we start to then take some of the fire out of that, and that's when that distress level really starts to drop. But in order to do that, we have to be able to say what it is. We got to be able to talk about it. And so, we say name it to tame it. If we can give that emotion a name, we can bring the distress level down as much as 70%. That's really, really important. Now, the whole way we're doing this, we're checking our intensity levels. So let's say, as I identify that emotion, it kind of triggers me again, and my distress level goes up. Well, I, again, need to be aware of that. I've got to be checking for that, because if that happens, then I need to back up to the distress tolerance tools again.
Do it over again.
Yeah, I got it. Or find another one, whatever's going to allow me to continue to move forward. Now, as I name that emotion and we start to get the distress level down even more, I'm starting to be able to use that front part of my brain again. And here's where I can start to explore what caused a triggering event to result in emotional hijacking. How does sitting in a meeting, sharing an idea that nobody says anything about, result in me being emotionally hijacked for the day?
Nobody did anything specifically dangerous towards you.
No.
There's obviously something in your history or your own perception that's...
And we call it the story in my head. So as I'm sitting there and I hear crickets, I'm not hearing crickets, I'm hearing criticism.
You're hearing this giant story go on in your head.
Exactly.
You made up that nobody else gave you.
They don't like me. They don't respect me. I'm not smart enough. I don't belong. And all of a sudden, boom, 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 this story grows into a reason to go into survival mode.
Same thing with the Instagram post.
Exactly.
When a kid doesn't get the likes, and then it's like, oh my goodness, they must be angry at me. My group of friends don't want to hang out with me. Nobody's, Same thing. We make up this giant story in our head. And unfortunately, it's usually not a very positive story in our head. It's this doomsday story.
And I would say that it's not usually, it's almost never. I mean, us human beings, we have this tendency when we have blanks to fill in. I mean, think about it as a parent, and your kid hasn't come home yet and they were supposed to be home an hour ago. Okay, there's a blank to fill in. What do you fill it in with?
Right.
Oh, I'm sure they're over at the neighbors doing a little service work right now, helping the lady get her garbage out to. No, that is not where we go. It's not what we do. We fill it
with the worst case scenario.
Worst case scenario. And it's catastrophic. And we go to these really scary places. And we do that again with ourselves too. Same thing. So
what I love about this principle too is that it's so helpful within relationships. Like for that example, right? A child's late coming home. I'll go to my wife and I'll be like, man, I've just got this story in my head that my son is, off in a ditch in, a car wreck, and I'm kind of freaking out. And as we just talk about it, openly say it, check that story in your head with someone, then we can go, well, what is the likelihood that that could happen? It could be, but it's probably like, there's 1,000 other things that could be.
Or what could we do to change opinion to fact?
Right.
Well, let's make a couple of phone calls and let's do a couple of things.
Let's find out before we get all distressed.
And that's really this part of the process is so important, because if we will take a minute, look at the story in our head and eliminate opinion and leave only fact, now we can problem solve, because you can't problem solve opinion.
Yeah.
But you can problem solve fact all day long. So we've got to get to that place. And again, we're checking our intensity level again. Because running the story through my head, may shoot my distress level right back up through the roof.
Yeah.
Then I got to go back to distress tolerance tools and get my work back into working on this issue. Now, once we can identify what's really going on, what I'm really dealing with, then we can start to problem solve. And that's just a very logical process. We can involve others in that process. We have to be careful that we're identifying the real problem.
Yeah.
We as human beings sometimes want to
address past stuff or get distracted with something else that's not really
right. Or again, try to identify a problem that isn't a real problem. It's more based on the story in our head than it is on fact. And so really sorting through, making sure we get to what the real problem is, and then come up with some potential solutions. And then try them. And the ones that work, keep. The ones that don't work, get them out.
Unfortunately, I think this is where most people want to go as soon as they realize they're emotionally hijacked.
Well, it's also the place that a lot of us outsiders want to go as soon as we see someone else who's hijacked.
Yeah.
So, teenage daughter comes home, slams the front door, stomps up the stairs, slams the bedroom door. Dad's like, oh no, what's going on? And so he beats it up the stairs, knocking on the door. Hey, I need to talk to you. Why? Well, because he wants to help.
Yeah.
But when we want to help, that usually means we want to fix the problem.
Sometimes they don't want to be fixed.
Well, and sometimes, like at that moment when she's hijacked, she can't.
It's not even going to do any good.
No, I'm going to go in there and I'm going to start to problem solve with her, and she's going to be mad and frustrated with me that that's what I'm doing, and she's going to bite back, and then I'm going to get mad and frustrated with her because she's not problem solving like I want her to, and then I get hijacked, and then we're hijacked squared.
Everybody gets hijacked.
Everybody's hijacked. Now we got lots of damage control to do, lots of cleanup to do after this one.
Yeah.
How often does that happen in a marriage? How often does that happen between an employer and an employee? How often does that happen between two people on the freeway?
Absolutely.
If we could just stop for a minute and say, okay, what part of this model, what part of this resilience model are they in? Because if they're in the hijacked part, don't jump all the way forward to problem solving. We've got to get their distress level down first. And it may be that, I start asking some questions of my daughter through the door that are going to get her to,
open up.
have to think. Let's get logical here. Let's, do something that gets her to have to think. Now, if we've been talking about these things in our home, and we have this language like you're talking about, then I can come home after work, hijacked, and say to my wife, I'm hijacked.
She knows exactly what that means.
She knows exactly what that means. Now, in my house, that means I need about 30 minutes. And in 30 minutes, we're going to sit down, and she's going to help me work through the story in my head.
Yeah.
Because I need those 30 minutes to get my distress level down. I'm going to practice a few distress tolerance tools. And then I'm going to get with her, and she's going to help me work through the story in my head.
And you can actually identify and solve problems.
Exactly. But it's only because we have this shared language now, and that we're aware of what's going on, not just because we've been married, but because we're human beings.
Absolutely.
And this is what we all do. So important for us to be clear about what we're trying to accomplish.
Yeah.
And where the other person is in this process helps us determine what we're going to accomplish first. And if that's to help them reduce their distress level, then that's what we got to focus on, not solving the problem.
Not solving the problem.
Right. So,
not just to fix it.
Okay, so we get to this place where we're now able to solve the problem.
I kind of call these next two stages the healing stages. Like this, you've done the problem solving, and now you kind of have to process the whole experience in these next two steps.
Yeah, and even probably also then maintenance stages as well, because if we'll take care of these couple of stages, we don't end up having to spend much time in the others, not as much time anyway, and get to spend more time in these later stages. This next one is to go with the flow. And what we mean by that is, and here's sometimes where, again, as parents, we get in trouble a little bit with our kids, and that is that we don't like it when they feel pain.
Right.
And
it's our job to keep them away from pain.
Well, and going back a little bit to talk about how we experience emotions, we experience them physically. So a painful emotion is physically painful. Well, so is me putting my hand on the hot burner on a stove. What do I do when I put my hand on a hot burner on the stove? I immediately get away from that.
Yeah.
And we have a tendency to then try to treat emotions the same way. So if it's painful, get away from it. Pull away from that. And we teach our kids that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, it's a natural thing that we have, that we're born with, but we as parents have a tendency to reinforce it. Because what happens to you and I when they're feeling pain?
Well, you feel pain with them.
I feel pain with them. And so if I can fix their pain, then my pain goes away. And a lot of times the easiest way to fix their pain is to have them not feel it.
Right. And which makes sense in the hot stove case. You know, you're not going to tell them to keep their hand on the hot stove, but there are other painful situations in life that they need to.
Yeah, taking your hand off the hot stove is an appropriate solution to that pain. Yeah. But getting away from, or we call it numbing, emotions is not an appropriate response to emotional pain. The appropriate response to emotional pain is to experience it, to feel it, to share it, to, you have to process through that. It's a part of our emotional growth and maturation in life. You think about those people who've gotten heavily involved in substance use and have used that to numb or regulate their emotional experience. When they get into recovery and they stop using, they're often very young emotionally. So you've got this, 30-year-old who deals with everything like a teenager. Well, that's why. Because emotionally, they're still a teenager when they started using, when they started numbing, and they stopped growing and maturing emotionally.
Gotcha.
So that's just where they're kind of stuck until they're able to start having that process. So it's important for us to really grasp this idea that we have to experience emotions.
Not to avoid them.
Right. We've got to step into them. We've got to be with them and allow them to happen.
That can be really scary for a lot of people.
It can. Again, we're built to avoid pain. And so we've got to kind of override that natural instinct to do something about the pain and allow the pain to exist. Sometimes solving the problem doesn't eliminate painful emotion.
Yeah.
If I've lost a loved one, if they've died, there's no problem solving I'm going to do that's going to change the way I feel. And so in that instance, I have to just feel. I've got to experience that.
Allow yourself to feel it.
Yes.
Not be threatened by it.
And I may do some of that by writing. I may do some of that by talking with others about how I feel and being able to share that. I may do that through meditation or prayer or, there's a lot of ways to be able to experience that emotion, but I have to experience it.
What really helped me understand this principle was the analogy of a boat on the ocean. And the waves of the ocean are emotions. In life, there are going to be emotions, and they're going to carry you to high points, and they're going to carry you to low points. And as the boat in the middle of the ocean there, if you orient yourself with the direction of the wave, you can ride that wave, or you can go with the flow of that emotion and not get tipped over emotionally. And that was a big one for me, because I think I naturally tend to just want to avoid emotion or stuff it or push away, or just like resilience is actually ignoring emotion and just, moving on.
Being stoic.
Yeah, but that doesn't help, right? That
No.
bottles them up.
No. Yeah, and the longer they bottle up, the more damage it does. To us, and it'll have a physical impact on us too. It'll decrease our good health and be a real struggle for us. So as we learn to be able to do that, this last part of the model, building connections, really is a natural fit here, because the more relationships we have, the more places we have to process emotion, to talk about emotion, to share emotion.
Absolutely.
But we've got to be careful, because we want to make sure that the people we have relationships with are safe to do that with. We want to pay attention, be mindful of who we're bringing into our life, who we're building those connections with. But this building connections is really ultimately what everything is about.
Absolutely.
It's ultimately what our life is about.
And there's a lot, I think the technology industry really caught on to that. That is the basic human need of connection. And so they offer connection in so many different ways, connected to Wi-Fi, connect to our online, community and these kind of things. And which we're finding is causing so much stress and higher distress levels within all of us.
It's a real challenge. We're missing some key components. We're mammals, and mammals require physical contact.
Yeah.
In fact, we know now in the hospitals where babies are born, the first thing they do, it used to be the first thing they did was, pulled that baby out, smacked their butt, got them to cry, and hauled them off to the nursery.
Weigh them and shoot them up.
Yeah, and the mom didn't see their baby for 2-3 hours, if maybe a whole day. They didn't see their baby. But that's very different now. They take them right from the womb and lay them on their mother's chest.
Yep.
And in some cases, even before they've cleaned them off.
Right.
Because that connection fires important neurochemicals inside the body that are important for our physical health, which is really interesting to think about. Right now, we have this problem going on, and we're calling it that isolation or loneliness is the new smoking.
Yeah.
Because what we're finding is those people who identify as being lonely, those people who don't have those connections, we're seeing the physical impact, and it's showing up in length of life.
Longevity.
Yeah, we're seeing that those who have reported being lonely for long periods of time are experiencing a shortening of their life equal to smoking 15 cigarettes a day.
So one day of isolation can have a similar impact on your longevity than smoking 15 cigarettes per day.
And we see that in the, again, length of life. And so the importance of having connection, the importance of having physical contact. It's nice that we have FaceTime, and it's nice that we have, all this technology that allows us to stay connected, social media, all of those things. Yeah, those are great, and there's certainly some benefits to those. But unfortunately, our society's allowed those to then be a substitute for personal connection. And personal connection, and it's funny, we talk about that right now with all of the quarantining and all of the, things that are going on. We talked in the beginning of this about some of these, statistics and the fact that they've been increasing. Well, all of these statistics are pre-2020.
Yeah.
They're all pre-pandemic. They're all pre what we've gone through.
Yeah,
last year.
Only know years from now the impacts.
Right.
We know it's
well, we see
worse.
some of that impact now. We've got anxiety levels with adolescents and children at all-time highs, unquestionably. And we've got to address this.
You mentioned the physical touch aspect, and going back to Colin Karchner, one of his big things was 8 hugs for 8 seconds a day.
Yeah.
And that means a lot in our family, because with all those kids, that's a lot of physical touch that they need. And we do that through hugs in the morning, when you're tucking them in at night.
Wrestling right after dinner.
Absolutely. And when they're in school, they have little moments of physical touch with their, peers, with high fives or putting their arm around their buddy or whatever, that contribute to those It's the oxytocin, right?
Yep.
It's that release of that neurochemical oxytocin. We call it the long-term happy hormone that can serve as kind of that connection, that happiness for a long time. But interestingly enough, through our modern technology, we're able to see that those same chemicals aren't released when it's done through a screen. As great as all this technology is, and that we have the ability to share information through screens, we're not getting that sustaining oxytocin, long-term happy hormone that we need for our health.
Right. What's the solution? Well, I don't know exactly what it is. There's a lot, but I think becoming more aware. I think, understanding some of what we've talked about today, just understanding how we work, allows us to make different decisions in how we interact and how we intervene when it's necessary to intervene. And I also think understanding the importance of these relationships, the importance of connection, and making decisions that will facilitate that instead of replace that. Another thing from Colin was quit giving your kids smartphones.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's something to be said for that. I know we live in a day and age where we want to be able to have that instant ability to contact or connect, call, talk to, know where they're at, those kind of things with our kids. That's fine.
Yeah.
But it doesn't require a smartphone. Because all a smartphone does is give them all those other options and all that information that I didn't have when I was a kid.
Yeah.
The information they have to process today is frightening.
Yeah, and just that our bodies, our brains were not evolved to handle the social input from thousands and thousands of people.
Yeah.
Usually our circle of influence, includes about 30 to 50 people. Which that is what we're programmed or evolved to be able to understand or process. But that's one of the major things we talk about in building connections is to realize that they're not going to get connection through this thing.
Right.
I often talk about how, like, you can, if you go through a difficult thing like your dog dying, and you post something on Instagram about how much you love your dog and your dog dies, you're going to, probably get 156 comments and, 250 hearts. And you're still going to sit there alone, grieving and having a hard time alone. When all you really need is one person to come up and put their arm around you and be like, man, I'm sorry that happened. That's tough. I really liked your dog.
Yep. One
person, physical touch, physical interaction. And that's where that healing really happens. And so, I think that the building connections portion of this is probably the most important when it comes to healing.
Yeah, no question. And it's the most important in terms of maintaining health, and particularly emotional health. Good, healthy relationships are going to change our life for the better. So all of what we've talked about today is to that end.
Yeah.
To give us the ability to have those connections, to have those relationships so that we can experience what we're intended to experience.
And when we heal from an experience like this and we realize I'm still here, I'm okay, I'm moving on.
Yeah.
That's resilience.
Yeah, exactly. So there it is. And we took a little while to get through all of that, but it's a really simple model. It's a really simple process. I think that the concepts here are very simple, but I think if you're like me, these make sense. As you hear this, as you hopefully spend some time studying more of this and learning more about it.
But we've got a lot of great resources on our website too. So for each one of these steps, there's a radio show, there's articles, there's all sorts of things that you can get more information about, which, like me, I realized this is, kind of that 30,000 foot view of resilience.
Yeah.
And when you realize like you really want to build that resilience, you got to go get the intensive training. You got to learn more about it. And that's essentially what we do.
Yep. There you go. That's it in a nutshell. So we appreciate the time with you and really, again, grateful. We're all about helping communities and helping those communities one family at a time.
Stronger families, stronger futures. Absolutely. And anxiety and depression is not going to go away. It's just going to, I anticipate it getting worse.
Yeah.
But we have the tools. We have the ability to apply the brain-based research that has been done for the benefit of our families.
So thank you. And any questions, any comments, we'd love to hear them. Reach out to us any way that's most comfortable and convenient for you. Love to hear from you.
Thanks.